Well, good afternoon to those in the audience and those of you joining us online. I'm Robert Litvak, Senior Vice President and Director of International Security Studies here at the Wilson Center. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Ambassador Tibor Nagy, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, back to the Wilson Center today for what promises to be an engaging, enlightening conversation about the current state of U.S. Africa relations. I'm also pleased to welcome all our guests who have joined us here at the Wilson Center today. Before us are distinguished members of the African and International Diplomatic Corps, as well as representatives from the government, NGO, private, and academic sectors. For those unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, it was established in 1968 by an act of Congress. Unlike the physical monuments in the nation's capital, it is a living memorial whose work and scholarship commemorate the ideals and concerns of President Woodrow Wilson, the first internationalist president, the only one to hold a PhD. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum, and we work to tackle global issues through independent research and open dialogue that informs actionable ideas for Congress, the administration, and the broader policy community. The Africa program is one of the regional programs at the Wilson Center. They were collectively recently ranked #1 by the University of Pennsylvania think tank poll, which is a reputational barometer, I think. And it works. The program works to address the most critical issues facing Africa and U.S. Africa relations, build mutually beneficial U.S. Africa relations, and enhance knowledge and understanding about Africa and the United States. And it is superbly led by my extraordinary colleague, Dr. Monde Mwangwa. Today's event comes after Ambassador Nagy's first visit to the Wilson Center in his capacity as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in August 2018. At that time, Ambassador Nagy shared his priorities for U.S. Africa policy and heard the viewpoints of members of the Africa Engaged community. Now we are pleased to welcome him back to the Center to look back on the past year and a half and consider where U.S. Africa policy stands today, what has been accomplished, what challenges remain, and what the road ahead looks like for the U.S. and African countries. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Mwangwa, who will introduce Ambassador Nagy. Thank you.
Thank you, boss, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. I wish to join Dr. Litvak in welcoming all of you to the Wilson Center for this very important and much anticipated discussion. In addition to welcoming all of you who've made the time to join us here at the Wilson Center this afternoon, I would also like to welcome those joining us online via webcast and Twitter. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow the live tweets by following the Africa Program's Twitter account @AfricaUpClose, and you can contribute to the discussion using the hashtag @U.S Africa Policy, all one word. We have a short time with Assistant Secretary Nagy this afternoon, and he really is a person who does not require an introduction, but to help situate our discussion with him this afternoon, I thought I should just say a few words about him. Because as we like to say on the continent, that your life's journey is telling of where you have been and how you see the future ahead of you. He is a distinguished and accomplished diplomat who has spent a lot of time, in fact, well over 20 years on Africa. He was appointed Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs by President Trump in July 2018. He retired, but he had spent 32 years in government service prior to that. 20 of those years, as I mentioned, were spent on Africa in 8 different Africa postings, including to Ethiopia, Guinea, Nigeria, Cameroon, Togo, Seychelles, and Zambia. Following his retirement from the Foreign Service, Ambassador Nagy served as a Vice Provost for International Affairs at Texas Tech University from 2003 to 2018. He received his BA from Texas Tech and a master's degree from George Washington University. He came to the United States in 1957 as a political refugee. One of the things I recall from his visit in 2018, which left an impression on me and which I believe sums up who he is a statement he made in introducing himself. He said he is Hungarian by birth, American by citizenship, and African at heart. So many of us were very pleased when he took over the Africa portfolio back in 2018. There have been a lot of issues, a lot of comment, a lot of discomfort in some circles about where we stand with U.S. Africa policy. But I do know that from talking with my colleagues over at the Department of State that there's a lot that has been going on in the year or so since he took this portfolio. And so he will update us on the vision that he shared with us when he came here in 2018, what the administration has done on U.S. Africa policy since, and what he sees as the way ahead for U.S. Africa relations. So he will speak with us for about 15 to 18 minutes, after which we will have a moderated discussion. With that, please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary Nagy to the Wilson Center and to this event.
Thanks very much, Mondi, for again inviting me to the Wilson Center. Sorry about the glasses. Age does that to you. And as I was telling Mondi earlier, now that I've turned 70, when we come to the questions, I prefer them one at a time. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be back here. It was a year and a half ago, as Mondi said, when I last spoke at this venue. When I began my role as Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, the Wilson Center afforded me the opportunity to share my vision for Africa policy. So it's only appropriate that I return to this venue, review the priorities I set out, and reflect on what has been accomplished. I will also assess the ongoing problems we need to address in the coming years and beyond. As I often note, I've been an Afro-optimist since my first posting on the continent in 1978. I am even more so now. In this job, I have so far visited 25 countries, held hundreds of meetings with African leaders, business people, young people, civil society representatives. And importantly, Africa is getting the attention it deserves from senior U.S. officials. Last month, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited Senegal, Angola, and Ethiopia. Undersecretary for Political Affairs David Hale traveled in February to Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania. 2019, he visited Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, Cote d'Ivoire, and Niger. These visits are significant. They signal that Africa matters to the United States. The last time I spoke here, I set out the following priorities. 1, to harness the potential of Africa's youth as a force for ingenuity and prosperity. 2, to work with African governments to create a level playing field for U.S. companies and encourage U.S. companies to do business in Africa. 3, to advance peace and security through partnerships with African governments and regional mechanisms. And 4, to counter China's narrative and make clear that the breadth and depth of the U.S. commitment to Africa is unmatched. I also promised to reach out to African diaspora community across the United States. During a trip to Houston, meetings here in Washington, I have met with representatives of diverse African diasporas. I am continually reminded how much such groups can help overall U.S.-Africa relations. They contribute significantly to the economic growth of their countries of origin and to American understandings of Africa. I plan on more engagements like these in the near future. Right now, I'd like to review some areas where Africa has seen positive change and progress in U.S.-Africa relations. First, Ethiopia. Ethiopia's reform agenda is breathtaking in its scope and ambition to improve the economic, political, and social life of its citizens. Since coming to power in 2018, Prime Minister Abiy has released political prisoners and journalists. He has formalized peace with Ethiopia's long-standing adversary, Eritrea. He has lifted restrictions on civil society and decriminalized opposition groups. Abiy views the opposition as competition, not the enemy. These developments are also having a positive effect on the participation of women in politics. Women now fill half of Ethiopia's cabinet, 37% of its legislature. Ethiopia also has its first female president, Sahle-Work. These are milestones undreamed of just a short time ago. We recognize that Ethiopia's reform agenda will require increased support from the United States and other partners. One example of our support is the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative. This initiative invests in projects to improve women's ability to own, inherit, or use land. We're also supporting the National Election Board and helping to build the capacity of the Attorney General's office. U.S. government is also providing $8 million to help fight a massive locust outbreak in the region. Foster greater private sector investment in Ethiopia, we brought together hundreds of potential investors in 2019 for the Ethiopia Partnership Forum at the State Department. Separately, the Secretary's Office of Global Partnerships led an investment delegation to Ethiopia in November of 2019. And during the Secretary's recent visit, he announced that Coca-Cola is making a new $300 million investment that will create thousands of jobs. Companies like FedEx, Citibank are exploring new opportunities as well. Secondly, Democratic Republic of the Congo. For the first time in its history, the Democratic Republic of Congo has a chance to live up to its name as both democratic and a republic. The election of Felix Tshisekedi marked the first peaceful transfer of power from an incumbent president to the opposition since the Congo's independence in 1960. After his inauguration, Tshisekedi pardoned scores of political prisoners, including opponents of former President Kabila. He opened political space and welcomed exiled dissidents back to the DRC. When Secretary Pompeo and I hosted President Tshisekedi last April, the Congolese leader stated his priorities were fighting corruption, strengthening governance, advancing human rights, and combating human trafficking. Tshisekedi injected a sense of urgency to combating the Ebola outbreak that continues to wreak havoc in the eastern DRC. The country may finally be turning a corner in terms of containment of the Ebola outbreak. HHS Secretary Azar, USAID Administrator Green, and other senior U.S. health officials visited eastern DRC over the last year to strengthen joint efforts to contain the outbreak. The United States remains the largest single country donor to helping the Congolese combat the spread of Ebola. I remain optimistic that President Tshisekedi is someone we can work with on trade and investment, countering corruption, promoting peace and stability in the region. GE just announced a multi-billion-dollar investment in DRC hydro and gas power, as well as healthcare over the next few years. We're stepping up our support for anti-corruption efforts and prosecutions investigations. We are also backing improved fiscal transparency in the extractive industry, and we are helping increase local government's capacity to manage new mining royalties that communities are now receiving for the first time. Then on to Sudan. In Sudan, former President Bashir's ouster after 30 years in power was an historic moment. In a matter of months, Sudan transitioned from an adversarial regime to a potential partner, and the United States played an important role, bringing about a civilian-led transitional government. Soon after Bashir's ouster, we dispatched Deputy Assistant Secretary Makila James for an initial round of discussions with all the factions. We also appointed veteran diplomat Ambassador Don Booth, Special Envoy for Sudan. Undersecretary Hale visited Sudan days after the Transitional Military Council and Forces for Freedom of Change agreed to form a transitional government. His visit underscored our interest in seeing a civilian-led government that reflects the will of the Sudanese people. And we hosted the first Friends of Sudan gathering here in Washington to build international support for the new regime. In January, I met with the head of the civilian-led government, Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, in Khartoum to discuss our shared vision of Sudan's democratic future. I also met with Chairman of the Sovereignty Council, Sudan, Al Burhan. I was impressed with the willingness of both leaders to work together for Sudan's future. Now, U.S. economic partnership with Africa. Furthermore, the administration has had significant achievement on the economic front. For one, the BUILD Act establishes the New Development Finance Corporation, or DFC. This gives the U.S. government new tools and resources to further expand our support for market-based, sustainable investment in Africa. This includes doubling the investment capital available to $60 billion and giving the DFC the ability to make limited equity investments. These commitments will contribute to job growth and economic opportunities, both in the United States and Africa, by having our missions in the field identify bankable projects. In April 2019, the DFC joined advisor to the President Ivanka Trump in Ethiopia to launch the 2X Africa initiative, a commitment to catalyze $1 billion of investment that economically empowers women. Prosper Africa is a new U.S. government-led initiative to substantially increase two-way trade and investment between Africa and the United States. Finally, for the first time ever, there will be a one-stop shop within the government to support U.S. companies seeking business in Africa. We have also created deal teams at our African missions to support U.S. businesses and work with local governments to strengthen the investment climate. The deal team model, developed in the Africa Bureau, has now been replicated for all our embassies worldwide. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, or MCC, continues to make major transformative investments in African countries that are committed to reform and good governance. Around 70% of MCC's investments are in Africa, with $3 billion in active compacts and another $1.8 billion in the pipeline. And this year, we are celebrating 20 years of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA. In 2019, 39 countries were eligible for AGOA benefits. AGOA requires countries to make progress towards developing a stable, attractive environment for investment. Other criteria include rule of law, market-based economy, workers' rights, and combating corruption. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, or AFCTA, is a promising start to truly promote a seamless Africa for trade and investment. However, the proof will come in its implementation and the elimination of non-tariff barriers that hinder cross-border trade. We support AFCTA. We also made it a priority to negotiate a bilateral free trade agreement with one or more African countries in the coming year. We are pleased that a free trade agreement with Kenya is now in the works. Youth. As I have stressed in almost every single speech, a youth tsunami is hitting Africa. The continent's population, as you all know, will double by 2050. This poses a huge problem for governments that do not create jobs and opportunities. These young people are as wired, connected, and savvy as their counterparts anywhere in the world. They want the same things: a good job, a nice house, and a safe and secure future for their families. At the forefront of our engagement with the continent's youth is our Young African Leaders Initiative, or YALI. YALI is now entering its 10th year. At every stop in my travels, I meet with YALI alumni. These engagements have reinforced my belief that YALI participants and Mandela Washington Fellows are some of the most impressive young men and women in the world. One 2016 YALI alum from Ghana was named the 2017 Daily Trust African of the Year for his work in the de-radicalization and reintegration of would-be extremists. Others have been recognized by numerous publications, such as Forbes, Time magazine. In Sudan, one of the new ministers in the transitional government, Wala Issam El-Bushi, is also a 2016 YALI alumni. YALI alumni are CEOs and entrepreneurs creating jobs. They are dedicated civil servants and activists, journalists, doctors, and scientists. All share a desire to build their countries. And the YALI network across the continent is now up to 650,000 young Africans. What I do know is that dollar for dollar, YALI is one of the best programs we have ever devised to build capacity in Africa. And the State Department has launched another program to help address Africa's growing need for educated, employable youth. The University Partnerships Initiative will strengthen existing ties between U.S. and African higher education institutions. It will deepen cooperation on student and faculty mobility, joint research, administrative capacity, and public-private partnerships. Last month, I hosted a forum attended by more than 170 guests from over 50 U.S. and African universities and government officials. Countries such as Ethiopia, South Africa, Rwanda, and Ghana are leading the way in U.S. Africa higher education partnerships. There is no shortage of good ideas. What we need in the next phase of the initiative is to identify the resources to implement them. China in Africa. With respect to China, we are challenging their narrative and strengthening our own public diplomacy outreach. We are reminding Africans that no one can match America's contributions. We are Africa's primary partner in areas such as health, empowering women, promoting human rights, supporting free and fair elections, combating child labor, and building the capacity of African peacekeepers. China continues to assert itself on the continent. We must encourage African leaders to choose sustainable foreign investments that employ Africans in good jobs and ensure that skills are transferred to African workers. Now, for the continuing problems and those ahead. The activities of violent extremist organizations, or VEOs, are spreading from the Sahel to Burkina Faso. They are threatening coastal states such as Togo, Guinea, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and Senegal. While Somalia has emerged from state failure to begin rebuilding the country, instability and VEO activity remain a persistent threat. Cameroon and Zimbabwe have demonstrated little willingness to confront domestic problems or to open up political space. The international community must also remain engaged in CAR in South Sudan to encourage internal peace and stability. We welcome the South Sudan Transitional Unity Government that was agreed to on February 22nd by President Kiir and Dr. Machar. I have appointed a distinguished three-time U.S. Ambassador, Stu Symington, as Special Envoy for South Sudan. He will lead our efforts to urge the parties to fulfill the terms of our 2018 peace agreement. The people of South Sudan must see the real peace and prosperity that they deserve. The United States will continue to work with regional leaders, international partners, to support peace and stability in South Sudan. Despite these problems, I remain encouraged by Africa's successes. During the UN General Assembly last September, my meetings with African leaders underscored that the U.S. is seen as an indispensable and trusted partner for Africa. I also promise you that as long as I am in this job, I will continue to look for every opportunity to strengthen and expand America's partnership with the continent. As we say in the Africa Bureau, let's continue to look at Africa through the windshield and not the rearview mirror. Thank you very much. Now I can get rid of these glasses.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Nagy, for that wide-ranging overview of what's going on in the U.S. Africa relations and policy space. Before I open it up to questions, let me just take the first opportunity to ask the first question.
Like you did last time.
I did. You've cottoned onto me. I just returned from the continent, and one of the things that I'm hearing from Africans at different levels, not just officials, but also ordinary citizens across the continent, is the framing of China's engagement in Africa by the United States. And I think part of what I'm getting is a sense that for many Africans, that framing is not nuanced enough to understand or to bring out both the positives of what China is bringing to the table, but also to raise the concerns about some of the issues that African governments and African people are concerned about in terms of Chinese engagement. There is a very real fear in certain circles on the continent that the U.S. framing of China in Africa could potentially lead to a Cold War Part 2, and Africans want no part of it.
Yeah.
So what's your response to that?
Is this on? Good.
Yes.
Yeah, neither do we. The last thing I think we want is to go through another era like we did with the Cold War, when African played a geopolitical chessboard between, the good guys and the evil empire. Here's the thing, and as I have said so often in some of my remarks around the continent, that, for a long time, when African countries had projects, big, construction, infrastructure, and there was a knock on the door for who's going to do that, and they opened the door. The only person standing there was the Chinese. Point taken. United States was late in realizing, exactly what was going on. And then at the same time, you have to step back and look at what was happening geopolitically. Because about 20 years ago, not just the United States, but I think the West in general said, okay, China is evolving quickly, so let's get China into these international institutions. And hopefully that will then transform China into opening up political space, liberalizing, operating by the rules of the world order. And instead, what happened, instead of the institutions remaking China, China obviously has had a strategic policy to remake the institutions in its own image. So, you get to the point of, so what's going to happen in Africa? It's a choice Africans are going to make. I talk about the advantages that American companies bring to China, and it has been pointed out to me, I'll visit a place and they'll say, wow, look at this wonderful stadium that the Chinese built. And then I'll say, okay, that's great. Look at that wonderful stadium the Chinese have built. But you know what? There wouldn't be people in that stadium if not for the United States of America saving millions and millions of African lives through our PEPFAR and HIV/AIDS programs. Uganda, take Uganda. We contribute $600 million a year to Uganda's health system. What a deal a country like Uganda has. We pay $600 million a year to support their health system, and the contracts go to China that Uganda then pays to China. There's something wrong with deals like that. So, we have to carefully consider moving forward. But of course, that's the whole purpose of things like Prosper Africa, Development Finance Corporation, because as I said, for a long time, when there was a knock on the door, it was the Chinese companies standing there, and we want to empower American companies to be able to step forward and participate in some of these projects, and we will do that more and more, because at the end of the day, U.S. companies transfer technology, they respect the laws of the country, they are not corrupt, they don't ruin the environment, they don't smuggle rhino horn out of the country, back to the United States, and they don't bring over thousands of Americans to do the jobs of anybody above turning a shovel. So, but like I said, 80% of life is showing up, and American companies have to show up. So I will do my best to encourage American companies to show up. Our embassies are working feverishly, not just to support American companies, but also to work with the host governments to put in place a type of environment that attracts U.S. companies. Because as somebody said, foreign direct investment is a coward, as it should be. And, so to attract money, you really do have to make the investor feel at ease. Sorry about the long-winded answer, but I'm pretty passionate about that subject.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We have about 50 minutes. I was going to ask another question, but I see a lot of people here, and we want to get as much interaction going. So I'll get into the moderated question and answer phase right now. And those of you who've been here know what the rules of engagement are, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, what I'm going to do is take a couple of questions at a time. So if you want to ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you, and we'll bring over a mic to you. You have exactly 1 minute.
Oh my gosh, no
And
speeches, in other words.
No speeches, absolutely. There are a lot of people here. We want to make sure, there's a reason people came here. We want to make sure that those who want to ask a question of the Assistant Secretary get the opportunity to do so. So once you get the mic, just state your name, the institution with which you're affiliated, if any, and ask your question. And then we'll give the Assistant Secretary an opportunity to answer the 2 questions, and then I'll come around for another round of questions. So, for those following online, you can tweet us the questions at Africa Up Close, and we'll try and read a couple of those questions as we progress through this. Could I ask the people who just came in to just quickly find your seats? We have a few empty seats around the edges. There's 2 up here. Mm-hmm. All right. So let me start right here. Whitney, and then back here. Can I get the microphone up here, please?
Great, thank you very much. Ambassador Nagy, nice
Oh,
to
come on, you can call me Tibor. How long have we known each other?
a long time. Thank you, Monday. So I'm Whitney Schneidman. I'm on the advisory committee here at the African Center and also at Covington. So Tibor, I'd just like to push back on your notion that Africa's getting the attention it deserves. Secretary Pompeo's visit was the first in 18 months by a current cabinet official. Yes, this is the 20th anniversary of AGOA this year, but it's also the 20th anniversary of FOCAC, which is the Chinese summit mechanism. So just to cut to the chase, for Africa to get the attention it deserves, it really needs the most senior level engagement by the U.S. government. I would argue it hasn't gotten it. One way to do it is to have a summit. Ambassador Lana Marks in South Africa has intimated that there will be a summit. I would just like to hear your views on whether or not you think that's important and whether it will happen.
I'll give you a short answer, my dear
I
friend
want a
Whitney.
long answer.
No. Stay tuned. Okay? Stay tuned.
Okay. Right behind him, right here.
Thank you. I'm Lawrence Freeman. I've been involved in economic development in Africa for about 30 years. I don't want this part of my minute, but happy Ottawa Victory Day, March 1st.
Yes.
On Sunday.
Absolutely.
Great breakthrough for Africa against European colonialists. My question has to do with Ethiopia. You know that there's negotiations that have gone on with U.S. Secretary of State Treasury Mnuchin. Recently, he wrote a letter, which I saw a copy of. He said that they signed a temporary agreement initialed with Egypt. Ethiopia was not at the meeting. This is not exactly the way policy should go. The U.S. was playing a facilitator role. Ambassador Shin, a friend of mine, issued a statement on his blog. The U.S. is putting its thumb on the side of Egypt. The Ethiopians think so also. Now, the U.S. president believes in America first, sovereignty. Why shouldn't Ethiopia have sovereignty and Ethiopia first? The Nile is in their country, the Blue Nile. Lake Tana is in their country. The dam is in their country. They did not sign the 1959 agreement.
All
They're
right,
working. Why shouldn't they have? Is there a double standard between the United States and Ethiopia?
I think people who know me know my sentiments on a whole variety of issues related to Africa. What I can say is the United States has consistently said that we are neutral in that whole business. We will do our best also working with those countries. They have very strong positions. Again, stay tuned.
Now the lady right there, you missed her the first time? Right there. Yeah, I'm coming. I see you all. I'm going to swing this way.
Thank you, Ambassador Nagy, and thank you to Mundi and the Wilson Center for this opportunity. You had a whole list of issues, and we are grateful for that. In 15 minutes, you did nice overview.
And I obviously missed some.
You missed one big one, which is climate change, where Africa is at the epicenter.
Yeah.
And the question, especially regarding trade and investment, that's focused heavily on oil, gas, and mining, including some of the examples you gave today. So the question is just, how do you balance out the fact that the UN says we have less than a decade to actually divert a climate catastrophe? And I'm from Liberia, where we're already seeing places like West Point, as I was sharing earlier with some colleagues, already today underwater, right, because of rising sea levels. So how do you balance out trade and investment that's still very focused on oil, gas, and mining with these very real concerns around climate change and its impact on Africa?
You're absolutely right about the companies that we're announcing the deals for, because as we all know, there are a whole slew of companies, and they tend to be the global majors that can do business anywhere from Antarctica to Zimbabwe. To really create jobs in Africa, what you need is to get medium and small U.S. businesses involved, because economically they're the ones that create the most employment. They're also the ones that are the most risk averse and may be unfamiliar with especially investing in places like Africa. To me, that is one of the whole purposes for Prosper Africa and creating the one-stop shop for U.S. businesses who want to go. I mean, I came back to Washington, sometimes I wonder why, from West Texas. And so I always run that through my West Texas filter of how can I get these companies in West Texas to invest in Africa. They need help. They need hand-holding. A lot of other governments have been doing that. I have felt a need for exactly an organization like Prosper Africa for at least 20 years. And, better late than never. But that's exactly that. We want to really broaden the type of U.S. companies that are investing in Africa, because we want to definitely move beyond just the mining, the extractive industries and things like that, much more to the whole gamut of what Africa needs. And also you look at, the industries that will end up creating the most jobs. So I'm totally with you on wanting to really, really expand the representation of U.S. companies. So thank you.
All right, thank you. I see you in the back. I'll be coming shortly. Let me just finish with this group over here, and then I'll move to the middle section and then move on to the back. So right here, the gentleman right up front here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. My name is François Ndengwe. I'm a journalist with On the Freak magazine. You just said that it seems that the West or the U.S. had a mistake in appreciating the Chinese strategy in Africa. From that, what's the decision you're going to take now? And have also a very second quick question.
My brother.
Nice. He's a journalist. He has to try.
I know. No, we'll come back for another round let's try and get as many people.
No, and I'll make it simple. I said that for years there was a knock on the door. The Africans open the door, and it's only the Chinese person standing there. I want to make sure that when there's a knock on the door, at least there's an American standing there too. Because at the end of the day, then it's the Africans who gain from that, from having a choice, instead of just taking the first deal that comes along, which often ends up not being that good of a deal if you look at it in retrospect.
Thank you. Right behind him, the two gentlemen over there, Nii, and then the gentleman sitting next to you.
Thank you very much. Nii Akwete with George Washington. Could you please let us know what the State Department, the Africa Bureau is doing about the coronavirus? Do you have a plan for going to the assistance of African countries in the same manner, or along the same lines as was done with Ebola? Thank you.
Yeah, on Corona, obviously it's not the Africa Bureau, the State Department that's taken the lead, and we just had all of our ambassadors in town last week, not just the ambassadors to African countries, but also our ambassadors around the world. And in the Africa portion, that of course was a fairly significant discussion, because no one knows what the extent will be. I mean, you look at Africa right now. As of right now, we have 2 confirmed cases, 2. And neither one happened to be Africans. I think both happen to be, internationals who were living there. But we know that there obviously will be more, and talking to our ambassadors, I don't like issues where you're having to react to events. I like issues where you can plan ahead and think, okay, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen. With this, we just don't know that, so our ambassadors in place are going to have to make some decisions, and the U.S. government is obviously getting organized with agencies like USAID. You know, we had to respond to the locusts, for example. This will be a much quicker moving event, and it will also require a whole of government response. So the planning is going there, but I can't tell you at this point what's going to happen in which particular country because we have no idea, unfortunately. But our ambassadors are prepared, our embassies are prepared, so we will react as well as we possibly can when things develop. But that's a great question. I think about that a lot these days.
Thank you. The gentleman right next to me.
Greetings, Mr. Ambassador. I am Martin Ayim. Well, Mr. Ambassador, we appreciate your effort in Africa, and we are very hopeful that it will continue. My question, a prosperous Africa, Mr. Ambassador, is one whose problems are tackled, the root causes of problems are tackled head-on. If we go round and round, we don't tackle the problems, Africa will continue to be struggling. I'm asking in the area of human rights abuse, human rights protection, and genocide, ongoing genocide in Africa right now, case in point, British Southern Cameroon's Amazonia. And the second problem is uncompleted decolonization on the continent. Where that is not the case, when there's no completed decolonization, there's a problem. The question is, what is and what will it take for the U.S. to make a statement and stop genocide and foster colonization and foster the implementation of, stopping decolonization?
You've hit about 5 subjects there, but I will do my best going through there. Okay, number 1. I think when I spoke to this group the first time, I said that over my many years in Africa, one kind of philosophy I built up for what the U.S. should and shouldn't do. I am not a proponent. I don't support issuing lots and lots of empty statements. With each new statement, you devalue the currency. And, if you issue statements, it makes you feel good, but it doesn't achieve anything. I really want to focus on achieving things. And I have found that one of the really, really good mechanisms or tools the United States has in moderating behavior are our sanctions policies. I have been absolutely, in many ways, delighted when I have visited around the continent, speaking to people, including leaders who have complained to me bitterly when we have sanctioned, say, a senior vice president someplace. And lo and behold, you find out that then the leaders start thinking, oh, wow, the United States sanctioned a senior vice president. Could they be getting ready to sanction me next? Because those sanctions really hurt, especially the elites. They really, really hurt. And I maintain that our sanctions policy has had an awful lot to do with some very recent advances moving forward. So I'm not that much into saying empty words. Sometimes we've issued so many statements that about the only way they would be impactful is dropping a carton of them on the head of the person we want to sanction. So I'm not into. I really want to change behavior. I want to end the atrocities. And then of course you hit on one of my deeply heartfelt pains, and that's Cameroon. And I keep thinking about what more could we be doing in Cameroon, because I know that every day the situation grows worse and worse. And in my own discussions with Cameroonians, I point out to the fact that, look at the United States of America. We won every single battle in Vietnam and we lost the war. And every day that the pain and the suffering goes on, unfortunately, more and more the people who live in Western Cameroon are starting to think seriously about favoring independence. And that, again, United States view is a unified Cameroon. We support a unified Cameroon because the last thing Africa needs is another mini-state that will be full of poverty and suffering and needing billions of dollars of foreign assistance to make it. And then what happens if you split off part of Cameroon? What happens in parts of Nigeria? So that's not what Africa needs at all. But the Cameroonian government needs to get serious about a genuine peace process, genuine decentralization, genuine power to the local level. And then you mentioned neocolonialism and colonialism. I remember that the first decision that the newly created Organization of African Unity had to take, very difficult decision, if you remember, was whether or not to recognize the colonial borders or to redraw them. And after much discussion, they took the very painful decision that they had to go with the colonial borders because the alternative was much worse. You had two very bad alternatives, and they went with the lesson. And I know that continues to be a huge problem in Africa. So thank you very much for the question.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nagy. And to my brothers and sisters, please stop trying to sneak in two questions. I have a lot of hands back there. I really need to give people the opportunities to bring their issues to the Assistant Secretary. And just I'll come to you. I just want to read a couple of questions that we got from Twitter. I think one you've already answered, but you might want to add to it. The first one has to do with Cameroon. And it is understanding that the right to self-determination is a right enshrined in international law. What are your views and prospects for addressing the escalating armed conflicts in Cameroon? I think you've answered that one, but if you want to add to it, certainly feel free to do so. The second one, and I think the genesis of this question has to do with the recent ban on Nigeria in terms of visa, the discussion that we're having. The question really is, where does Nigeria fit into U.S. strategy for Africa?
Well, the second one's kind of easy to answer because we just had our strategic dialogue with Nigeria. We had a Nigerian delegation of 70, including several of the ministers leading it, and Nigerian foreign minister. We had an extremely fruitful day discussing a number of critically important issues. And of course, because it was at that time that the visa restrictions were announced, that was part of our discussions. And our Nigerian colleagues understand what has to be done in their passport system to come up to the requirements that we're looking for. And I've heard it called a ban, travel ban and everything like that. What it does, it restricts certain visa categories. Yeah. And if you look, we have... I'm not a consular officer, but I will say that we have at least 70 different visa categories. And in none of these is it a full, all 70 categories. As a matter of fact, even in Nigeria, what has not been restricted is what we call B1, B2 visa, which is tourists and business visitors. And again, we had lengthy discussions on this. The Nigerians understand what needs to be done to make changes to their system. And then, as with two other countries during the last year, then we can look at eliminating those restrictions and moving forward. So it's great, and it's easier to say a visa ban or to sensationalize the stories. But the story, like with Nigeria, it's a very technical issue, but that's very difficult to write up in the media.
No, absolutely, and thank you so much for correcting me on that, because the words do matter, and a restriction is very different from a ban. And so I think, just for the record, that what's going on here is a discussion about restrictions.
And let me just add, in my remarks, I talked about how much I want to increase university partnerships between U.S. and African universities, because I know in my heart that U.S. universities are the absolute best partners to help African universities take the function they should be taking and be instruments of national development, which means we need a lot more African students coming to the United States and students going in the other direction. And if there's a ban, then how in the world are we going to get African students over here? I mean, I've had direct experience. I was, the faculty sponsor for the African Student Organization at Texas Tech. And like at Texas Tech, and I'll just one category, Nigerian students had the third highest grade point average of any nationality group. So yeah, we definitely need more African students in the United States because they're tremendous enrichment to us.
Thank you. And I think that just also builds onto the role of and the contributions of the African diaspora to this country, which are sometimes neglected in the broader discussion about how we engage and view our engagement with Africa. So thank you very much for making that point. All right, let me turn to this section. I'm coming, people. Let me start right here. And then I'll come to the lady behind you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Assistant Secretary, thank you very much for your very informative and very encouraging remarks. As you know, President Trump was quoted as having characterized African countries broadly in very insulting, vulgar, and deeply racist terms. How does that affect the ability of professionals like you to build mutually respectful relationships with African countries? And in what way does that encourage investment of American private companies in Africa? And I'd appreciate a really frank.
Yeah, I love that question. That's the first one I ever got, when I was coming into this job. And I'll tell you the same thing. I don't get that question, interestingly, from Africans, because the whole concept and the importance thing is by thy deeds thy shall be known. And those of us who work on Africa, we love working with Africa. We appreciate what the United States does. We, the United States, we don't just invest in Africa, we invest in Africans. And I have been received with open arms by African elites, by African young people. So, yeah, I get that question about 50 times a year. But I have absolutely no qualms, no hesitation in representing the administration because I'm looking at the results and I'm looking at what America is doing in Africa. So people can keep asking me that question. Does not bother me one bit. I represent the United States of America, and I am proud of what we are doing in Africa, including this administration.
Ambassador, thank you so much. I'm from Cameroon. I'm from Southern Cameroon. Please. Please. I'm a mother. It's been a lot of talk. We need action. People got massacred recently. We need you to take action, please.
The question speaks for itself. It's not even a question. And I think we all understand exactly what you're saying. As I said, Cameroon has pained me more than any other issue I've had to deal with. Human suffering is not philosophical. It's not something up there. I'll never forget that as a little boy in Budapest during the Hungarian Revolution, I saw people that had been run over by the Soviet tanks. And even when you're 7 years old, that picture stays in your mind forever. So I totally understand. I wish there was a magic bullet that we could fire to fix the situation. As I said, the international community needs to be absolutely united on this. because of the outrages recently, I'm very much hoping that there will be much more of a unity in our willingness to be firmer in responding to this with the Cameroonian government. I wish the Cameroonian government would recognize the fact that there's no way they are going to win this militarily. As Gandhi said, when you have a policy based on an eye for an eye, soon or later the whole world is blind. And that is exactly what is happening there. It's a disaster. It is absolutely needless. And I wish that there was a simple way to just put a stop to it at this moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And the lady right behind you, there's to the other side, 2 places away from you. I can't.
Thank you very much. My name is Amaka, and I run the Africa program at Eurasia Group. My question is, in response to Munde's question about the China-U.S. relationship, you still focused a lot on what China is or isn't doing. Could you articulate instead exactly what the U.S.'s interest is in Africa outside of countering China without regard to China, right?
You missed my point on on the $600 million just in Uganda.
Okay. And then also just why those 3 specific countries you mentioned at the top.
Which ones?
Ethiopia, DRC, and Sudan. There was no mention of
because I only
Nigeria.
had 15 to 18 minutes to talk. So, give me a break. I mean, I if I was teaching on African like I was, during the last 18 years, we could go on for hours and hours and hours. But when I'm given 18 minutes, I'm try to be disciplined and speak for 18 minutes. So you obviously, pick the lower hanging fruit. I mean, we could talk on and on about, for example, Somalia. That could show up on either list right now, or even South Sudan and on. We could talk in detail about so many different countries. I personally feel bad when I just mention a few because, 54 countries we're talking about here. But on the China business, I mean, again, this goes to the heart of the issue. There's that wonderful stadium. But what about, the billions of dollars the United States has given on the humanitarian side, on the health side, on education, governance, human rights, and on and on and on. And, people kind of overlook that. And that really, really irks me. Because the American people are the most, this is your money. It's your money that goes to help Africans. And the other thing I say, great, China's making all those deals. They can have all the corrupt dictators they want to. I just want the youth of Africa. I'll put my money on the youth because they're not going to tolerate that. When you have, some people that are 4 times as old as the average, African citizen. I hate to tell them. I mean, I know I just turned 70 this year. They're somewhat older. There's an end line there. But those young people are going to be in charge someday, and that's going to be totally different. Thank God.
Sorry. All right. Could you grab the mic, please? There's a lady right behind, right there, and then I'm going to swing around this way. So, yes, please.
Oh, so that's how it works. When you don't raise your hand, you get selected. I think my hand was raised first. Anyway, I am Angela Pashayan. I attend Howard University. I'm a PhD student in political science and international relations. I work in poverty reduction, but specifically at the slum level. So I go below that middle, lower tier that all of our programs target. And so my question to you is, do you have any ideas or any foresight on new approaches to reach poverty below the proletariat?
Yeah. Man, I wish I had a silver bullet there as well, as well as for some of this horrendous situation in Cameroon. On the absolute poverty level, and again, obviously, this group knows that when we talk about poverty at the African level, we're talking much different than poverty at the U.S. level. Jobs, jobs, jobs. That's the only thing. Jobs, jobs, jobs. As I tell a lot of audiences, my first assignment was Africa, Zambia, 1978, and I left as ambassador to Ethiopia in 2003. And during that period of time, we went through at least 4 different theories of development. 4 different ones, very different. The only thing they had in common was that none of them worked. Good. Well, let's talk. You know, after this thing, I would be delighted to hear any kind of new ideas, because it's been extremely frustrating when you spend as much time in Africa and you see such little change.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to swing around this way, and I'm going to ask everybody else, and then we have 20 minutes, and I want to get as many people into the discussion here.
Or until my voice goes out.
Well, we hope that doesn't happen, sir. So let me do this. I'll take the gentleman over. I'm going to swing it out this way. I see you all. I'm coming. Let me take the gentleman over here and the gentleman right next to him, and then we'll swing that way and bring it home. But please be as concise as possible.
Which gentleman?
Oh, okay. You self-nominated, but that's okay. Let's go.
The Lord Jesus blesses you, sir. Thank you. I'm Brother Choransom. I'm a preacher. I come from southern Cameroon. I'm an immigrant here. God permitted me to have the DV. And I want to thank the USA for everything, first of all. I come in the humanitarian aspect. I'm 45 years old. I do DSP work in the USA to take care of orphans back in Africa. And I take care of orphans most from the Francophone side of Cameroon. These same people are the ones killing my people. How do you expect me to clean poop for people who are sick and send back the money to take care of their children? And their parents are killing my own people who are crying for something that the USA can come into and just put self-determination by putting even a military buffer zone. How do you want me to do when I'm over here in the US? Look at the children being killed. Look at the massacre.
All right,
Look at
brother.
children. Can you people please help us put a military buffer zone to separate the two before we look into their problems?
Can I make a suggestion?
Thank
Look,
you.
I appreciate. I know that for my Cameroonian brothers and sisters in here, this is not an academic exercise or just a dialogue.
Yeah.
Lives are on the line. People are being killed. I know I was talking to my sister earlier on. She knows people that have been killed. So I appreciate you. I feel where you're coming from. And I think the Assistant Secretary has put on the table the pain that he feels as well. What I would like to suggest, maybe with Nicole and Mark, if they're in here, is that at some point we organize maybe a separate discussion so that we can have this discussion separately to go deeply into it to figure out if there's anything beyond what is currently being done that can be done. And so I'm not trying to take your voice or agency away from you, but I think the point has been made. The Assistant Secretary has acknowledged that, and he gets it. And so we can talk after this to figure out how do we move this dialogue forward in a way that can help us to really try and address some of the issues that have come up. So thank you very much.
And let me just add, the hardest countries to deal with, especially from my position, are the ones where I served, where I've been on the roads, I visited those villages and towns, and I know exactly what we're talking about. It's not an academic exercise. It's real life. So believe me, my heart is there with Cameroon.
Thank you. All right, so let me very quickly, I'll take 30 seconds from the remaining people so we can get everybody in. I see 7 hands. I'm going to take all 7 of you, and then we'll bring this to a close. So very quickly, 30 seconds, my brother.
Bafo Sefrimpong, international scholar at Wilson Center. Ambassador, thank you very much. My question has to do with the issue that you highlighted with regard to growing activities of terrorism in Africa, particularly in Burkina Faso. I would like to find out from you what specific strategies that your administration has in place to support regional and continental mechanisms to address the issue.
Yeah, that is one of the most complex questions right now, because that is one area where the situation is getting much worse by the day. I mean, we saw it start out, frankly, from Libya, impacting Mali, then the rest of the Sahel. Now, as I mentioned, the coastal states are quite worried. And as those of you who know Africa know, this is not just a simple situation of violent extremism, because it's like peeling away an onion. And, you know, it even gets into the question that was raised early on about colonialism, because we all know that those borders in the Sahel are artificial. And then you look at the individual Sahelian states, and as I try to explain to people, each of those states is twice as big as the state of Texas. And that's the territory that we're talking about. And then, even though we now have all of these regional mechanisms, we're mobilizing the international community, other European countries are getting more involved. At the end of the day, the whole effort is as strong as the weakest state that's involved. And by weakness, I don't necessarily mean weak in the numbers of its army or gendarmerie or anything like that, but weak in the willingness to confront its own issues. So when you're dealing with so many states, so many vulnerabilities, so many efforts, whether it's the French in Operation Barkhane or the G5, Sahel, or now ECOWAS talking about it, and then to make the matters even more complicated, it's not that far from the Sahelian crisis to the Lake Chad Basin, where you have Boko Haram now split into two, with the other one, in many respects the more dangerous one, ISIS West Africa, and the potential for link-ups between the various terrorist organizations. It is a monumental effort, but it also requires very close coordination, a lot of, as we say, moving pieces. That's one of the reasons that we are in the process, and I can't make any public announcements yet, but we're definitely looking at having a special envoy for the Sahel, just as we just recently appointed for South Sudan. Personally, and I've said this publicly, I'm not a fan of special envoys, because I'm a very strong supporter in ambassadorial responsibility and authority. But there are certain situations that are so complicated and require so much coordination that a special envoy makes sense.
Thank you. Let me swing it this way, right there. Yes, you already have the mic.
Yeah, Doug Brooks, International Stability Operations Association. Thank you very much for coming and meeting with us today. My question kind of follows up on that, is the follow-ups on, say, ACOTA and GPOI programs that I would argue were instrumental in turning the corner in Somalia. Do we have any other programs in the works that are going to follow up on that and improve African capabilities for peacekeeping operations?
Well, you know, we're always looking at that very, very carefully as to what can be the most effective. And, you know, as everybody knows, Department of Defense is undertaking a review right now. There's been a lot of publicity given to that in advance. I can assure you that most of that is pure speculation. So we have to wait to see what the final, you know, evaluation results will be. But I can assure you, from the Department of State's point of view, we are definitely not pulling back in the Sahel. I mean, an awful lot of the programs are being funded by the Department of State. And as I just said, we're actively looking at appointing a special envoy. And we just had, our ambassadors were just back. We had some very fruitful discussions on that. Whenever I travel to Africa, I'll go through Europe and stop in. I stop in and have discussions either with the EU or with my colleagues in London or in France. So there's an awful lot of movement going on, and this is going to take a bit of time. It's not going to be an instantaneous solution, even with the strongest will of all of the participants. But everybody is engaged. I mean, I visited all of the coastal states, and I can tell you in my discussions with the leaders, they are extremely, extremely engaged and concerned.
Let me move it, the lady right there.
Hi, thank you. My name's Paige Cowie. I work at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I want to circle back to the issue of climate change, especially in terms of agricultural development, and also especially in the wake of the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords. Can you speak towards U.S. policy in sustainable agriculture development in Africa, particularly in terms of climate change adaptation?
Well, I can't speak on climate change, but I can tell you definitely that in addition to Africa's population doubling by 2050, the calculations are that it needs a 70% increase in food production. And that's another reason I'm a huge proponent of the university exchange program, because if you remember, it was the provision of land-grant universities in the United States back in the 1800s that actually worked actively with farmers that resulted in the United States literally becoming the breadbasket for the entire world, and U.S. farmers becoming unbelievably productive. And we know that the same thing can happen with Africa, and with scientific methods, the 70% increase would be no problem whatsoever. So, that's the direction I want to take, is dramatically increase food production, and by that you also do significant enhancement to the economic viability of the farmers.
Thank you. Right there, gentleman, right back there. Yeah, I see you. I'm coming. Don't worry.
Thank you. Abraham Ash with the Washington Examiner, and thank you for discussing this speculation about U.S. Africa Command, its review, budget, and possible cutbacks. I wondered if you could go into a little bit more detail about specific programs that you're supporting to strengthen African partner nations' security in fighting violent extremism organizations, and how you might ramp up if, in fact, Africa Command were to scale back.
Okay, for Africa Command questions, you need to go to DOD and the Africa Command. Our Department of State programs are very country-specific. They're bilateral. We do have some regional programs too, especially like Gulf of Guinea, maritime security. So we have a list of programs with each country, and I'll be happy to give you the list country by country if you're that interested, because that's all public information. But as I said, what I want to underline, Department of State remains very engaged in the Sahel with Sahelian security. We are not cutting back. We are very, very proactive in supporting our partners to fight the extremism.
Can you highlight a specific success?
Somalia is one. Niger, we've had some great cooperation with the Nigerians, and then we can talk a little bit more in detail.
Thank you. So let me wrap it up over here. All right, yeah, you have 30 seconds.
My name is Yaya Fanusi. I'm with United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. My peers and colleagues are not in this room. 2025, the 54 countries in Africa will become like United States of America, a political federation. It's going to happen. As soon as I get the constitution given to me, I'm going to present it to President Trump and ask him to adopt it as his African policy. If he refuses, I'm going to recruit Putin, the Iranians, Cuba, Brazil, Chile, and India to adopt it. Okay? And it's going to happen. The federation is going to happen. All of these things you all are talking here is trivia.
I wish you luck.
Those who will oppose it are the ones who need luck.
All right, I think that's
77 years old.
all right. Yeah. Your point has been made. I think. All right. Work with me, my brother. You see me? All right. Look, the point that you are making is that while there are forces that are going against multilateralism around the world, Africa is now focused on multilateralism, and it's looking to make sure that we can build on that multilateralism to unify Africa. The second point that you're making, which is where we started from in talking about China, is that you're really making a point about Africa has choices. And so I think that's where I want to leave that. And the United States can choose how it wishes to engage, and I think we just leave it there. Let me do this. This has been a very, very useful discussion, and I really must thank you for coming out and giving us this really broad-ranging overview of where the Trump administration has come with on Africa, what has been accomplished since you took office, and some of the key points that you see on the road ahead. Just to go back to some of the key points that you made. You made the point about being an Afro-optimist. For me, that is really important. I think for far too long in many Western countries, there has been this attitude of seeing Africa as nothing more than this big blob of inconvenience and challenges. Yep. That has gotten in the way of how we engage. And who leads your Africa portfolio in terms of their outlook on the continent and to the opportunities that exist for this country to engage with Africa in a much more beneficial way to both entities? I think that's really important. And quite honestly, as somebody who's been working in this space, I really get tired of this look at Africa as nothing but full of challenges. We miss the opportunities to engage. So I think that's an important point that you made that's worth noting. You also talked about the senior leadership engagement. And what I want to do here is meld some of the concerns I had in the audience with where you were coming from. I, for one, had no idea that we had that much senior official engagement with Africa. But I think Whitney's point is a critical one. Not just in and of itself about getting even more senior engagement with the continent, that's going to be important, but it's also juxtaposing that against what other regions who they're sending to engage with the continent. So I think that's another takeaway, because whether we like it or not, as human beings and especially as countries, your emissary matters. Right? The respect we have for people who are doing the work at the technical level, and then there are those who symbolize the engagement that is necessary. So I think you've given us a good lay of the land in terms of that senior level engagement that has been happening, and I hear a little bit of a plea to elevate that and to continue doing that at an even more senior level. So and perhaps more frequently, not just the seniority, but also the frequency of that engagement. So I think that's a key takeaway that I'm getting from here. You gave us a good overview, and I heard you in the challenge in responding to Amaka, but you spotlighted some of the progress that's being made in the country. In Ethiopia, we talked about, in the DRC, we talked about, and in Sudan, you talked about. And that is all very important, and we are glad to see that you are acknowledging some of the advances that the continent has made, but also looking at some of the challenges. What I really liked, I liked a lot about both what the audience had to say and what you had to say. You started off with your passion and the importance for harnessing Africa's youth. That is precisely where the future of the continent rides. So how we invest in youth, what the U.S. is doing to invest in youth so that we can continue to propel and help the continent move forward, I think is very important. The work with African governments to create level playing field in the business sector, advancing peace and security, countering China's narrative, and reaching out to the African diaspora. I do want to go back to the issue that you raised on, I think it was on China. So I think I get your point. And one of the questions that I had in listening to you was, you're absolutely right, that at a time when Africa needed partners, particularly in the economic sphere, the U.S. was nowhere to be found. And so that infrastructure has been built for U.S. engagement. But what I thought I heard in the audience in talking about that infrastructure is that the infrastructure is kind of biased towards the big Fortune 500 companies, and that those sometimes come with their own issues as well. So what are we doing to expand the infrastructure to accommodate the SMEs, the African diaspora, which is really active and engaged in this country, so that they can also engage, And as the Fortune 500 companies engage, who tend to engage in the extractive industry and the damage that happens, what can we do to manage that the climate, the impacts of the extractive industries when it comes to climate and climate change and the environment? So I think that was a really important question, and I know measures are being undertaken, but I'm taking that as a key takeaway, that how do we interrogate the infrastructure that we're putting in place to ensure that it's more inclusive and that we have these different layers of participation, and that we are acknowledging and engaging with the environmental impact. I think the word that my sister used was Africa is at the epicenter of this, and it truly is. You can't deny that if you've been, as most of us have been, to the continent. So I think that was another big takeaway, and that was really important. You talked about the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and I was glad to hear you say that the U.S. is supportive, because there are a lot of questions on the African continent about that, especially how the bilateral free trade agreements articulate with the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And I think one of the big takeaways there would be we probably need to do even more to talk about that articulation, because there's a concern. And the last thing we want is for Africans to walk away feeling that the United States is trying to undermine this entity that they feel is a game changer for them. So I don't know nearly enough about the subject you do, but I think that's one of the areas that came out. I was really happy to hear you talk about education, and I'd love to find out more about the initiative. For me, education is the great amplifier. Mm-hmm. Absolutely the great amplifier that the continent needs, and it has to be the right type of education. I say this all the time, and people are going to beat me up over the head because I keep saying it, is that it's not just about the education, in that we tend to teach for the Africa that is or the Africa that was, yes, rather than the Africa that we want to see. Yep. And how do we transform the educational sector to get to that vision, which is absolutely powerful. And if the United States can play a role in that, a lot of things on the African continent will take care of itself. Let me conclude. I know there was a whole lot more. We covered a lot, and again, thank you so much for correcting me on the visa restriction versus a visa ban. So to all my Nigerian friends, don't tweet at me. But that's an important distinction to make. But it is an issue of concern in the African community. Sure. And so seeing where this goes, Nigeria is so big, and as Nigeria goes, in many cases, so does the rest of the continent. And how Nigeria as a superpower is treated, I think many other African countries take their cues from that. So it matters beyond what just happened to Nigeria. A lot of questions on infrastructure and engagement on the DoD front, and you've pointed us in the right direction on that. Let me conclude on our friends, my brothers and sisters from Cameroon. There's no doubt in my mind that the Assistant Secretary heard you. This is a very real problem, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to engage some more and figure out what can be done on this end. And even as we talk about what can be done on this end, I also happen to think that this is one of those areas where African governments, African regional institutions, the African Union should do more than they are doing. And I know I'm probably going to get into trouble for saying this, but I do firmly believe that. So it has to be a multifaceted strategy. And with that, I could go on and on, but I realize we're at time. I want to ask all of you to please join me in thanking Assistant Secretary Thibault Nagy for coming here and speaking with us today. It's really important, and the fact that so many of you turned out and the numbers that you turned out is reassuring. There's a very small but very active and engaged Africa constituency in this region, and so it's reassuring to see that those of you who've been on the trenches on U.S. Africa relations, you're represented here in your numbers in engaging with the Assistant Secretary, and I know he's taken something away from this event. So to all of you, thank you so much for coming and for engaging and for asking the Assistant Secretary the questions that you ask. To the Africa program team, Hannah, Ian, Sharazad, Gamu, Emily, and Stephanie, and the entire Wilson Center team, thank you for putting this on. And